The crimson trail of blood in the dusty road caught Frank Vaughn's eye before he even saw her. It was 1876, a blistering summer day in Miles City, Montana, when the woman stumbled into view, her blue dress torn and soaked with red, her golden hair matted against her face as she reached out a trembling hand. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant piano music drifting from the saloon. Frank didn't hesitate, not even for a second. He leapt from his horse and caught her just as her knees buckled beneath her. "I've got you," Frank said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. In 6 years of driving cattle across the frontier, he'd seen plenty of blood, but something about this woman's desperate green eyes made his heart hammer against his ribs. She was a stranger, but in that moment, nothing mattered more than keeping her alive. Amelia Barton had never imagined she'd die in a dusty Montana street. The daughter of a Boston banker, she'd come west with dreams of independence and adventure, not of bleeding out in a stranger's arms. The stagecoach robbery had happened so fast, the masked men, the gunshots, her desperate escape through the wilderness. She'd walked for miles, holding her wounded side, following the thin trail of smoke that led to this town. "They're coming," she managed to say before darkness crowded the edges of her vision. The cowboy's face, strong-jawed and sun-browned beneath his worn hat, was the last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away. Frank swept her into his arms, ignoring the blood soaking into his shirt. "Doc!" he shouted, already moving toward the physician's office at the end of the street. "Doc Miller." The townspeople of Miles City had grown accustomed to violent bar fights, and the occasional shooting were part of frontier life, but the sight of Frank Vaughn carrying a bleeding woman through town turned heads. Frank kicked the doctor's door open without breaking stride. "Good Lord!" Doc Miller exclaimed, clearing his examination table with one sweep of his arm. "What happened?" "Don't know," Frank said, laying the woman down as gently as possible. "Found her like this. She's been shot." The old doctor didn't waste time with more questions. He cut away the blood-soaked fabric, revealing a bullet wound on her left side. "It went through clean," he muttered, more to himself than to Frank. "Lucky girl. Fetch me water and those bandages." Frank moved automatically, following the doctor's terse commands while keeping his eyes on the woman's face. She was beautiful, even pale and covered in trail dust. Something about her seemed out of place in Miles City. Her hands were too soft for frontier work, and the quality of her torn dress spoke of Eastern wealth. "She's lost a lot of blood," Doc Miller said, cleaning the wound. "But if infection doesn't set in, she might pull through. You know her." Frank shook his head. "Never seen her before. She said they're coming right before she passed out." The doctor glanced up sharply. "Trouble then, likely." Frank moved to the window, scanning the street with narrowed eyes. "I'll stay with her." "You planning on being her guardian angel, Vaughn?" Doc Miller's tone was gruff, but there was understanding in his weathered face. Everyone in Miles City knew Frank Vaughn's story, how he'd ridden into town 3 years ago, quiet and haunted after losing his family to Sioux raiders. He'd built himself a small ranch outside town, kept mostly to himself except when driving cattle, and had earned respect for his fairness and steady hand. "Just until she's safe," Frank replied, not examining his own motives too closely. "Someone tried to kill her. Might try again." The doctor nodded, finishing his work with practiced efficiency. "She'll sleep for hours. I'll send Billy to fetch Sheriff Reed." Frank settled into the chair beside the examination table, his Winchester rifle across his knees. He couldn't explain the fierce protectiveness that had taken hold of him. Perhaps it was simply that he'd seen too much death on the frontier, or perhaps it was something about her, something he couldn't yet name. Amelia drifted through darkness, fragments of memory slicing through her consciousness like shards of glass. The stagecoach rocking over rough terrain, the sudden crack of gunfire. Her father's papers, the documents that would expose the corruption clutched against her chest as she ran. The burning pain in her side. When she finally opened her eyes, the room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp. Her side throbbed with dull pain, but the sharp agony was gone. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. "Easy now," a deep voice said from beside her. "Doc says you shouldn't move much." Amelia turned her head to find herself looking into the steadiest pair of blue eyes she'd ever seen. The cowboy from the street sat beside her, hat resting on his knee, his face etched with concern. "Where am I?" she asked, her throat dry as sandpaper. "Doc Miller's office in Miles City," he answered, offering her water. "I'm Frank Vaughn. Found you in the street yesterday morning." Amelia took a careful sip, memories flooding back. "Yesterday, I've been unconscious that long." Panic surged through her. "My satchel, it's here," Frank assured her, nodding toward a worn leather bag on a nearby table. "Nobody's touched it. Sheriff Reed wanted to look inside for identification, but I figured that was your business." Relief washed over her, followed quickly by wariness. In her experience, men didn't respect women's privacy without reason. "Why would you do that?" Frank's expression remained steady. "Lady shows up shot and scared. Seems to me she's earned the right to explain herself in her own time." His simple decency caught her off guard. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. I'm Amelia Barton." "Miss Barton," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Don't suppose you'd tell me who's after you. Hard to keep watch if I don't know what I'm watching for." "You're keeping watch." The realization that this stranger had been guarding her while she slept made her chest tighten with an unfamiliar feeling. Seemed the thing to do. His matter-of-fact tone suggested he couldn't have considered any other course of action. Amelia studied him in the lamplight. Frank Vaughn was not what she'd expected to find in Montana territory. Beneath the trailed dust and stubbled jaw was a face that suggested intelligence and character, not handsome in the polished way of Boston gentlemen, but compelling in its strength and honesty. She made a decision. "I was on the Billings stagecoach. 3 men stopped it 10 miles outside town. They killed the driver and guard." She swallowed hard against the memory. "They were looking for something specific." "For what?" Frank asked, his voice gentle but urgent. "Documents," she said, glancing at her satchel. "Evidence of land fraud against the Northern Pacific Railroad. My father was a banker who uncovered it before he died. I'm taking the evidence to the federal marshal in Helena." Frank's expression darkened. "Northern Pacific has powerful friends, including Judge Wilson here in Miles City." "That's why I can't stay," Amelia said, again trying to sit up despite the pain. "If they know I'm here, you're not going anywhere yet," Frank said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've lost too much blood. Besides, riding out injured is exactly what they'd expect. Safer to heal up first." The door opened before Amelia could argue further, admitting a gray-haired man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Ah, our patient is awake," Doc Miller said, approaching the table. "How's the pain, miss?" "Barton," she supplied. "Amelia Barton. It's bearable, thank you." The doctor checked her bandages with efficient hands. "Wounds clean, no signs of infection. You're lucky, Miss Barton. Another inch to the left and we'd be having a very different conversation." "When can she travel?" Frank asked. The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Not for at least a week, possibly 2, and even then only with care." He turned to Amelia. "Young lady, you need rest and proper nursing. My office isn't set up for extended care." "She can stay at my place," Frank said, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. "It's quiet outside town. Easier to keep watch. Both the doctor and Amelia stared at him. "Mr. Vaughn," Amelia began, "while I appreciate your help, my housekeeper, Mrs. Gunderson, lives on the property," Frank added quickly, understanding her concern. "Her reputation in these parts is fearsome. Your virtue would be safer there than in the church." Dr. Miller chuckled. "He's right about Mrs. Gunderson. That woman could scare off a grizzly with one look. And Frank's place is defensible, if trouble comes looking." Amelia weighed her options. The town hotel would be the first place her pursuers would search. Continuing to Helena in her condition was impossible, and something in Frank Vaughn's steady gaze told her she could trust him. "Very well, Mr. Vaughn," she said finally. "It seems I'm in your debt." Frank shook his head. "No debt, just doing what needed doing." He stood, settling his hat on his head. "I'll fetch the wagon and Mrs. Gunderson. Doc, can we move her tonight?" "Better under cover of darkness," the doctor agreed, mixing a powder into a glass of water. "Miss Barton, drink this for the pain. I'll prepare a packet of medicine for Mrs. Gunderson to administer." After Frank left, the doctor helped Amelia sit up to drink the bitter medicine. "That's quite a man, our Mr. Vaughn," Doc Miller said conversationally. "Lost his wife and daughter to Sioux raiders 3 years back. Came here to start fresh. Keeps to himself mostly, but there's not a person in Miles City who wouldn't vouch for him." Amelia felt a pang of sympathy. "He seems honorable." "That he is," the doctor agreed. "First time since the tragedy I've seen him take such an interest in anything beyond his cattle." He gave her a meaningful look. "Whatever your trouble is, and I suspect it's considerable, you couldn't ask for a better protector." 2 hours later, Amelia found herself carefully tucked into a wagon bed filled with straw and blankets, jolting slowly away from town. Frank drove the horses with careful precision, avoiding ruts that might jar her wound. Beside her sat a formidable Norwegian woman with iron-gray hair and hands as strong as any man's. "You rest now," Mrs. Gunderson instructed, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "Mr. Vaughn, he is careful driver, but roads they are bad." The night was cool, the Montana sky ablaze with more stars than Amelia had ever seen in Boston. Despite her pain and fear, she felt a strange sense of peace watching the heavens wheel above her. Frank's broad shoulders were silhouetted against the starlight, a steady presence in a world that had become terrifyingly unpredictable. "How far?" she asked after they'd been traveling for some time. "Another mile," Frank answered without turning. "Small place but solid. Built it myself." "You live alone?" The question fell forward the moment it left her lips. Mrs. Gunderson snorted softly. "He lives with his books and his horses. Too much alone, not good for a man, Mrs. Gunderson thinks everyone should be married with a dozen children," Frank explained, a hint of humor in his voice. "She's made it her mission to civilize me." "Someone must," the older woman said firmly. "You work, you sleep, you work again. This is not living." Amelia heard the affection beneath the housekeeper's scolding. These two shared a bond deeper than employer and servant, perhaps the bond of shared grief, as Mrs. Gunderson had the weathered look of someone who had known her share of sorrows. They turned off the main trail onto a narrower path that wound through stands of pine. Finally, they emerged into a clearing where a cabin stood, larger than Amelia had expected, with a barn and corral nearby. Lamplight glowed from the windows, and smoke curled from the stone chimney. "Welcome to my home," Frank said simply as he drew the wagon to a stop. The next few days passed in a blur of pain, sleep, and gradual healing for Amelia. Mrs. Gunderson proved to be an excellent nurse, applying poultices to her wound and brewing herbal teas that tasted terrible, but seemed to speed her recovery. Frank kept his distance, respecting her privacy. but she was always aware of his presence, checking the perimeter of the property, tending his small herd of cattle, or working in the barn. On her fourth day at the ranch, Amelia felt strong enough to venture onto the porch. She wore one of Frank's shirts over her borrowed skirt, the fabric swimming on her slender frame but clean and comfortable. The Montana summer sunshine felt glorious on her face after days indoors. She spotted Frank by the corral, working with a young horse, his movements patient and gentle as he accustomed the animal to a saddle. There was something mesmerizing about watching this strong man exercise such careful restraint, communicating with the nervous horse through subtle body language and soft words she couldn't quite hear. Mrs. Gunderson appeared beside her with a cup of tea. "He has the way with horses," the older woman observed. "Animals, they know good hearts." "He's been very kind," Amelia agreed, accepting the tea gratefully. "Kind, yes, but sad." Mrs. Gunderson shook her head. 3 years is long time for grief, too long. Amelia watched as Frank successfully mounted the young horse, guiding it in a slow circle around the corral. The doctor mentioned he lost his family. Wife and little girl, 6 years old. Mrs. Gunderson crossed herself. Rebecca and Emma, their names were. Good people. He never speak of them, but their pictures still by his bed. The information made Amelia's heart ache. She'd lost her father only months ago and still found the grief overwhelming at times. She couldn't imagine losing a child as well as a spouse. Frank noticed her on the porch then and raised a hand in greeting. After dismounting and securing the horse, he walked toward the cabin, removing his gloves. "Should you be up?" he asked, concern evident in his voice as he reached the porch. "Mrs. Gunderson says I need fresh air," Amelia replied, noticing how the sun brought out golden flecks in his blue eyes. "You have a beautiful home." "It's coming along," Frank said, glancing around the property. "Still plenty to do." Mrs. Gunderson made a dismissive sound. "Always he says this. 3 years, always more to do, never finished enough to live." Frank gave the older woman a look that was equal parts exasperation and fondness. "Don't you have bread to bake or something?" "Yes, yes, I go." Mrs. Gunderson patted Amelia's shoulder. "You sit. Not too long, still healing." She disappeared into the cabin, leaving them alone. Frank leaned against the porch railing, his hat pushed back on his head. "She means well. She's wonderful," Amelia said sincerely. "You're fortunate to have her. I know it." He studied her face. "You're getting some color back. That's good." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with things unsaid. Amelia broke it first. "Have you heard anything from town? About the men who might be looking for me?" Frank's expression turned serious. "Sheriff Reed sent word yesterday. 3 men arrived asking questions about a woman matching your description. They're claiming you stole valuable property from the Northern Pacific Railroad offices in Billings." Amelia's grip tightened on her teacup. "That's a lie. The documents were my father's. He paid with his life for discovering their scheme." "I believe you," Frank said simply, "but Judge Wilson's already signed papers authorizing them to search for stolen property. Sheriff Reed's holding them off with bureaucracy for now, but it won't last." Fear coiled in Amelia's stomach. "How long do I have?" "Few days at most." Frank straightened. "I've been thinking. The stage to Helena doesn't come through Miles City for another 2 weeks, but there's a settlement called Fort Benton 3 days' ride north. Steamboats stop there on their way upriver. You could board one, be in Helena before Wilson's men figure out you've gone. 3 days' ride." Amelia glanced down at her side. "I'm not sure I can manage that yet." "We take it slow," Frank assured her. "And I know trails they won't. Mrs. Gunderson's brother has a place halfway there where we could rest." Amelia caught the pronoun. "We," Frank met her gaze directly. "I'm not sending you off alone, Miss Barton, not with what's at stake. Before she could object, he added, "I know these lands, they don't. Out here, that makes all the difference." She wanted to argue, to insist she couldn't accept more help from this man who already had done so much. But the truth was, she needed him. Without Frank Vaughn, she'd never reach Helena alive. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "You don't know me. Those documents don't concern you. This could cost you everything." Something flickered in Frank's eyes, pain, determination, something more she couldn't name. 3 years ago, I wasn't there when my family needed me, was driving cattle to Cheyenne when the raid happened. His voice remained steady, but she could hear the cost of each word. "Couldn't save them, but I can help you. That's reason enough." The simple honesty of his answer moved her more than any elaborate justification could have. "Thank you, Frank," she said softly. Using his given name for the first time, he nodded once as if sealing a pact between them. "We'll leave tomorrow night, after dark." That evening, while Mrs. Gunderson prepared travel provisions, Frank spread a map across his kitchen table. "We'll follow Beaver Creek north," he explained, tracing the route with his finger. "It's longer than the main trail, but less traveled. First night we'll camp here in this stand of cottonwoods. Second day takes us to Mrs. Gunderson's brother's place." Amelia studied the map, trying to memorize the terrain. "And if we're followed, there are places along the way where we can lose a trail." Frank indicated several spots. "The creek has rocky shallows where horses leave no prints. And here, there's a canyon with a hidden exit most folks don't know about." Mrs. Gunderson approached with coffee. "You take my good rifle," she told Frank firmly, "and extra ammunition." "Yes, madam," Frank agreed with the hint of a smile. "We're traveling light, but I won't skimp on protection." The older woman turned to Amelia. "I pack medicine for your wound. Change bandage morning and night. No arguing." "I wouldn't dare argue with you," Amelia assured her, earning a grunt of approval later after Mrs. Gunderson had retired to her small room off the kitchen. Amelia found herself alone with Frank by the fireplace. The dancing flames cast a warm glow over the simple but comfortable room, with its handcrafted furniture and bookshelves filled with volumes that had surprised her: histories, poetry, even philosophy. "You read Emerson," she'd commented earlier, discovering the familiar work among his collection. "Helps pass the winters," he'd replied with a self-deprecating shrug that suggested he thought she might mock his intellectual interests. Now, watching him clean his revolver with methodical care, she found herself wanting to know more about this complex man. "Tell me about your ranch," she said. "How did you come to settle here?" Frank's hands continued their work, but his expression softened slightly. "Came through Miles City after the war. Like the country, big sky, good water, decent grazing. Worked as a trail boss for the Diamond B outfit until I saved enough to buy this land." "You built everything yourself?" "Most of it." He reassembled the revolver with practiced efficiency. "Had help with the barn raising. That's the way of things out here. Neighbors pitch in, even when they're 20 miles apart." "It's very different from Boston," Amelia observed, thinking of the formal calling cards and rigid social hierarchies of her former life. "I expect so." Frank set the cleaned weapon aside. "Your father was a banker there," Amelia nodded, memories of her father bringing both warmth and pain. "Yes. Barton and Sons, founded by my grandfather. My father believed banking should serve ordinary people, not just the wealthy." She traced the rim of her coffee cup. "That's what got him killed. He discovered Northern Pacific was using fraudulent loans to seize homesteaders' lands along the planned railway route." Frank's eyes narrowed. "That's been happening all across the territory. Small ranchers driven out by mysterious foreclosures. The documents in my satchel prove the fraud goes all the way to the territorial capital. My father compiled evidence for months. Her voice caught. The night he planned to take it to the authorities, there was a robbery at our home. They shot him in his study. "I'm sorry, Amelia," Frank said quietly, the gentle use of her given name somehow making her feel less alone with her grief. "The police called it a burglary gone wrong, but I knew better. I took his papers and came west to finish what he started." She met Frank's gaze. "I won't let them stop me." "No," he agreed, something like admiration warming his voice. "I don't believe you will." The shared understanding between them felt significant somehow, as if in recognizing each other's determination, they'd formed a connection deeper than their circumstances might warrant. For the first time since her father's death, Amelia felt truly seen by another person. "We should get some rest," Frank said eventually, breaking the moment. "Long ride tomorrow." Amelia nodded, suddenly aware of the lateness of the hour and the impropriety of their situation, a fact that seemed absurdly irrelevant given the dangers they faced, yet still made her cheeks warm. "Good night, Frank," she said, rising from her chair. "And thank you for everything." He stood as well, their proximity in the firelit room suddenly charged with something neither was ready to name. "Sleep well, Amelia." They departed the following evening as planned, with Mrs. Gunderson fussing over final preparations and extracting promises from both to exercise caution. Frank had selected his steadiest mare for Amelia, a gentle sorrel named Penny who moved with a smooth gait unlikely to strain her healing wound. "She'll follow Thunder without much guidance," he explained, indicating his own mount, a powerful black gelding. "But you handle a horse well enough from what I've seen." "My father believed all proper young ladies should ride," Amelia said, adjusting her seat in the western saddle different from what she was accustomed to, but manageable. "Though I suspect his idea of proper riding didn't include fleeing armed men through Montana territory." The ghost of a smile touched Frank's lips. "Probably not." He checked the rifle in its scabbard one last time. "Stay close. We'll ride until midnight, then rest." They set out under a waxing moon, leaving the cabin behind and following a narrow trail that wound through pine forests before opening onto rolling grasslands. The night was clear and cool, the vast dome of stars overhead making Amelia feel simultaneously insignificant and part of something grand. Frank rode slightly ahead, his posture relaxed but vigilant, occasionally raising a hand to signal a change in pace or direction. They spoke little at first, both listening for sounds of pursuit, but as the miles stretched behind them without incident, Amelia found herself drawn into conversation with her quiet companion. "Have you always worked with cattle?" she asked as they rode side by side across an open meadow, the horses' hooves muffled by thick grass. "Since I was 12, Frank replied. "My father had a small spread in Kansas. Nothing fancy, but he taught me the trade." "And you fought in the war," he nodded. "Union cavalry." "Enlisted at 19, served until Appomattox." His tone didn't invite further questions about those years, and Amelia respected his reticence. Instead, she told him about Boston, about growing up as the only child of a widower who treated her more as a protégée than a daughter, teaching her banking and business when other girls her age were learning embroidery and watercolors. "He sounds like an unusual man," Frank observed. He was. Amelia smiled at the memory. "Stubborn, principled to a fault, the kind of person who couldn't let an injustice stand, even when fighting it cost him socially and financially." "Sounds familiar," Frank said, glancing at her with something like gentle teasing in his eyes. "Are you suggesting I'm stubborn, Mr. Vaughn?" she countered, surprised by the lightness she felt despite their circumstances. "Wouldn't dream of it, Miss Barton." His low chuckle warmed the night air between them. True to his word, Around midnight, Frank led them to a sheltered copse of cottonwoods beside the creek. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said, dismounting and helping Amelia down with careful hands that lingered at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with her healing wound. Flustered, Amelia busied herself with her saddlebags while Frank tended the horses. They made a cold camp, unwilling to risk a fire that might be spotted. Frank spread a bedroll for her on soft grass, then prepared to take the first watch. "You need sleep too," Amelia protested, seeing the fatigue in the lines of his face. "I'll wake you in 4 hours," he promised, settling against a tree trunk with his rifle across his knees. "Sleep now. We've got hard riding ahead." Despite her concern, exhaustion claimed Amelia quickly. She drifted into dreams filled with hoofbeats and gunfire, only to be startled awake by a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Easy," Frank murmured, his face close to hers in the pre-dawn darkness. "Just me. Your turn to watch while I catch some sleep." Amelia nodded, accepting the rifle he offered. "Anything I should know? All quiet so far." He settled onto the bedroll she'd just vacated, hat tilted over his eyes. "Wake me at first light." Watching over Frank's sleeping form, Amelia felt a curious mixture of vulnerability and strength. Her side ached dully, a reminder of how close she'd come to death. Yet here she was, armed and alert in the Montana wilderness, responsible for this man's safety as he'd been for hers. When Frank stirred with the first gray light of dawn, Amelia was struck by how peaceful he looked in those brief moments between sleep and wakefulness, before memory and responsibility reclaimed him. The hard lines of his face softened, making him appear younger than his 34 years. "Morning," she greeted him, offering the coffee she'd prepared using water from their canteens and the small supply of grounds Mrs. Gunderson had packed. "You let me sleep too long," he said, but accepted the tin cup with evident appreciation. "The extra hour improved your disposition, I think," she replied with a smile that surprised her with its ease. They continued their journey as the sun rose, following Beaver Creek northward. Frank set a careful pace, watchful of Amelia's injury while covering as much ground as possible. By midday, they'd crossed into more rugged country, with limestone bluffs rising from the grasslands. It was near one such formation that Frank suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. "Riders," he said quietly, pointing toward a distant ridgeline where 3 small figures could just be made out against the sky. Amelia's heart raced. "Wilson's men. Can't tell from here, but we shouldn't take chances." Frank assessed their surroundings. "This way. There's a place we can hide until they pass." He led her toward the bluffs, following what appeared to be a game trail until it disappeared into a narrow fissure in the rock face. The opening was barely wide enough for the horses, but inside it widened into a small canyon, hidden from the main trail and shaded by stunted pine trees clinging to the rock walls. "Old Crow hideout," Frank explained as they dismounted in the sheltered space. "They used it during the last war with the Sioux. Not many white folks know it's here." "How do you know about it?" Amelia asked, stretching her stiff muscles carefully. "Had an Absaroka guide once when I first came to this country. Man named Two Hawks. He showed me places most settlers never see." Frank unsaddled the horses, allowing them to drink from a small spring that bubbled from the canyon wall. "Saved my life more than once with that knowledge." They settled in to wait, sharing jerky and hardtack from their provisions. The enclosed space created an intimacy that made Amelia acutely aware of Frank's presence, the clean scent of him beneath trail dust, the careful way he moved, always mindful of her comfort and safety. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured after they'd eaten. Frank looked wary but nodded. You can ask. Mrs. Gunderson said you never speak of your wife and daughter. She hesitated, seeing his expression close slightly. I understand if you'd rather not. It's just, after my father died, I found that not speaking of him made the loss harder, not easier. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, softly, Rebecca loved to sing, had the sweetest voice you ever heard. Emma took after her, always humming, making up little songs about whatever she saw. His eyes were fixed on some middle distance. When I found them after the raid, the house was so quiet. That's what I remember most. The silence. Amelia felt tears prick her eyes. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked. No. Frank looked at her then, really looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You're right. Not speaking their names doesn't honor them. On impulse, Amelia reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and strength in his fingers as they curled around hers. They sat that way in silence until the sound of distant hoofbeats made them both tense. Frank moved to the canyon entrance, peering carefully through the narrow opening. 3 riders, he confirmed in a whisper when he returned to her side. Moving fast. One of them matches the description of Wilson's foreman. They're following our trail, Amelia said, fear constricting her throat. They're trying to, Frank corrected. But we crossed rocky ground for the last mile. They'll lose the trail soon enough, double back to search. He checked his pocket watch. We'll wait another hour to be safe, then continue north. Should reach Mrs. Gunderson's brother by nightfall if we push hard. The hour passed with excruciating slowness, both of them listening for any sound that might indicate the riders had discovered their hiding place. When Frank finally judged it safe to leave, the relief of being back in motion was tempered by the knowledge that their pursuers were now between them and Fort Benton. We'll have to swing east, Frank decided as they rode. Longer route, but less chance of crossing their path again. The detour took them through increasingly rough country, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through rocky passes where riding was impossible. By late afternoon, Amelia's wound was throbbing painfully, though she said nothing. Frank seemed to sense her discomfort nonetheless. There's a place to rest just ahead, he told her, his concern evident. Need to check your bandage anyway. The place turned out to be another hidden hollow, this one beneath an overhanging rock ledge beside a small tributary of Beaver Creek. Frank helped Amelia dismount, his hands steady and careful. Let me see, he said once she was seated on a fallen log. Amelia hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety of allowing a man who wasn't a doctor to examine her wound. Frank seemed to understand her reluctance. Just need to make sure it's not bleeding again, he explained. Mrs. Gunderson would have my hide if I let you ride yourself into a fever. His matter-of-fact tone eased her embarrassment. Amelia unbuttoned the side of her borrowed shirt just enough to expose the bandage. Frank knelt beside her, his touch clinical and respectful as he checked the dressing. No fresh blood, he reported with evident relief. But it's time for clean bandages. I'll turn my back. True to his word, he moved away to give her privacy while she applied the salve misses. Gunderson had prepared and wrapped a fresh strip of cloth around her torso. The simple consideration touched her deeply. Thank you, she said when she'd finished. Not just for this, for everything. Frank was about to respond when a distant crack split the air, a rifle shot, followed by another. Down, he commanded, pulling her to the ground behind the log as more shots rang out. They've found us. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs as Frank drew his revolver. How we were so careful, must have split up to search. Frank's voice was calm despite the danger, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above them where puffs of smoke revealed their attackers' positions. 3 of them spread out along that rise. They've got the high ground. Another volley of shots kicked up dirt near their position. The horses whinnied in fear, straining at their ties. "We need to move," Frank said. "They'll work their way down to surround us. Can you run?" Amelia nodded, though her side screamed in protest when she shifted position. "What's the plan?" "There's a stand of pines about 50 yards downstream. Better cover there." He pointed to a dense thicket barely visible around the bend in the creek. "I'll lay down covering fire. When I say go, you run for those trees. Don't stop, don't look back." "What about you?" Fear made her voice sharp. "Right behind you." Frank checked his ammunition. "Ready." Before she could answer, he rose slightly and fired 3 rapid shots toward the ridge, forcing their attackers to duck for cover. "Go, now." Amelia ran, bent low, pain lancing through her side with each step. The distance to the trees seemed to stretch endlessly, bullets kicking up spray from the creek beside her. She didn't look back, trusting Frank's promise to follow. She reached the pines, gasping for breath, and pressed her back against the thickest trunk she could find. Only then did she turn to see Frank, still at the log, exchanging fire with the men on the ridge. "Frank," she called, terror gripping her as a bullet splintered bark inches from his head. He fired once more, then sprinted toward her position, zigzagging to present a more difficult target. He was halfway to the trees when Amelia saw him stumble, his left arm jerking with the impact of a bullet. But he kept moving, diving into the cover of the pines beside her. "You're hit," she gasped, seeing the blood soaking his sleeve. "Just grazed me," Frank said, though the tightness around his eyes told a different story. "We need to keep moving. They'll be coming down after us." "Let me bind it first," Amelia insisted, already tearing a strip from her underskirt. Frank allowed her to tie the makeshift bandage around his bleeding arm, his breath hissing between his teeth when she pulled it tight. "The horses, we'll have to leave them," she said, knowing what it cost him to abandon the animals. "They'd slow us down in these woods." He nodded grimly. "There's a trapper's cabin about 2 miles from here. If we can reach it before dark, we might stand a chance." They set off through the pines, moving as quietly and quickly as possible, both of them fighting pain with each step. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant as the forest thickened around them, but Amelia had no illusions that they'd lost their trackers entirely. The sun was setting when they finally reached the cabin Frank had mentioned, a crude, one-room structure of logs and mud chinking, abandoned for the summer while its owner worked the northern fur country. Its dirt floor and smoke-blackened walls offered little comfort, but the solid door and single window made it defensible. "Not much," Frank acknowledged, securing the door behind them, "but better than open ground." Amelia sank onto a rough-hewn bench, exhaustion making her limbs tremble. Now that they'd stopped moving, the full impact of their situation hit her wounded, on foot, with armed men hunting them through unfamiliar wilderness. "What now?" she asked as Frank checked the cabin's meager contents, finding half a bag of beans, some coffee, and a few matches left by the trapper. "We rest," he said simply. "Nightfall will slow them down. By morning we'll have a better idea where they are." He glanced at the darkening sky through the cabin's single small window. "I'll keep first watch." "Let me see your arm first," Amelia insisted. Frank hesitated, then sat beside her on the bench, allowing her to examine his wound in the fading light. The bullet had carved a deep furrow along his upper arm, painful but not life-threatening if they could prevent infection. Amelia cleaned it as best she could with water from their canteen and a relatively clean cloth from her saddlebag, which she'd managed to grab before they fled. Frank endured her ministrations silently, though she felt the tension in his muscles when she probed the wound's edges. "I'm sorry," she said softly, applying pressure to stop the sluggish bleeding. "For what?" His voice was rough with pain. for bringing this danger to you, for involving you in my fight." Frank's good hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "It became my fight the moment I found you bleeding in that street." His eyes, shadowed in the dimness, held hers. "I don't regret it, Amelia." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. They were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the stubble darkening his jaw. For one suspended moment, she thought he might kiss her, and realized with startling clarity that she wanted him to. Instead, he stood abruptly, moving to the window. "Try to sleep. I'll wake you if anything changes." Amelia curled onto a pile of old furs in the corner, her body exhausted but her mind racing. Whatever was growing between them was as unexpected as it was powerful and impossible to examine too closely when their lives hung in the balance. She must have dozed despite her racing thoughts, because the next thing she knew, Frank was gently shaking her shoulder. "Amelia, wake up." The cabin was pitch dark except for a sliver of moonlight through the window. "What is it?" she whispered, instantly alert. "They're out there," Frank replied, his voice barely audible. "3 of them moving through the trees, must have tracked us here." Fear froze her for an instant before she forced it aside. "What do we do?" "There's a root cellar under that trapdoor." Frank indicated a square outline in the dirt floor. "It's small, but you could hide there, and leave you to face them alone." She shook her head emphatically. "No." A hint of admiration flickered across his face before he nodded. "Then we make a stand together." He handed her his revolver, keeping the rifle for himself. 5 shots left. Make them count." They positioned themselves on either side of the cabin's single window, where they could see the clearing in front of the structure. The moon cast the scene in silver and shadow, the dark forms of pine trees standing like sentinels around the small open space. Minutes stretched into an eternity of waiting, both of them barely breathing as they strained to hear movement outside. Then a voice called from the darkness. "We know you're in there, Miss Barton. Those documents belong to Judge Wilson. Hand them over and we'll let you walk away." Frank glanced at Amelia, who shook her head firmly. They both knew it was a lie. "No deal," Frank called back. "Ride out now and we won't have to bury you." A bitter laugh answered him. "Bold talk for a man outgunned and cornered. Last chance. The documents or we burn you out." Amelia felt cold dread settle in her stomach. The cabin's dry timber would catch quickly if they set it ablaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Frank. "This is my fight, not yours. Maybe if I go out, they'll kill you and take the documents." Frank cut her off, his voice gentle but implacable. "Your father died for this evidence. Don't make his sacrifice meaningless." "Then what do we do?" Frank's expression was grim in the moonlight. "We create a diversion. There's a back wall where the chinking's loose. If I can slip out that way while you keep their attention at the front, that's suicide," Amelia protested. "Not if you're good enough with that revolver to make them keep their heads down." His confidence in her made her stand straighter despite her fear. "I'll circle around, try to even the odds." Before she could argue further, a flaming arrow arced through the night and thudded into the cabin's roof. Another followed, and another, the dry wood catching quickly. "No time to debate," Frank said, already moving toward the rear wall. "When you hear my shot, start firing at anything that moves at the tree line. Keep them pinned down." He paused, looking back at her with an expression that made her heart constrict. Then, in 2 swift strides, he returned to her side and pulled her into a fierce, brief kiss. "For luck," he murmured against her lips before disappearing into the shadows at the back of the cabin. Amelia touched her mouth, stunned by the suddenness of the gesture and the flood of emotion it released. Then smoke began to drift down from the smoldering roof, bringing her sharply back to their desperate situation. She positioned herself by the window, Frank's revolver steady in her hands despite her racing heart. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, and she could hear men's voices outside, arguing about whether to rush the door. A shot cracked through the night Frank's rifle, from somewhere to the left of the cabin. Instantly, Amelia leaned out and fired 2 quick shots toward the tree line where she'd seen movement, ducking back as return fire splintered the window frame. Chaos erupted outside. More gunshots, shouts of confusion and pain. Amelia fired again when she glimpsed a figure darting between trees, satisfaction flooding her when the man fell with a cry. Frank's strategy was working. The attackers were caught in a crossfire, uncertain where to direct their attention. Smoke was filling the cabin now, making her eyes water and her lungs burn. The roof wouldn't hold much longer. Amelia fired her last 2 shots to provide cover, then grabbed her satchel and ran for the door, staying low. Outside, the night air was sweet relief after the smoke, but she had no time to savor it. She flung herself behind a woodpile as a bullet kicked up dirt where she'd stood a moment before. From her new position, she could see one man lying motionless near the trees, another firing blindly toward where Frank's last shot had come from. "Amelia," Frank's voice came from her left, barely audible over the crackle of flames now engulfing the cabin. "Run for the creek, now." She didn't hesitate, sprinting toward the sound of running water beyond the trees. Bullets whined past her as she ran, but the darkness and confusion worked in her favor. She reached the creek and splashed across, the cold water shocking against her heated skin. Frank materialized beside her, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "2 down," he reported breathlessly. "Third one still out there." "Your arm," Amelia began, seeing fresh blood on his sleeve. Later, he cut her off. "We need to move. Fire will bring others." They pushed deeper into the forest, following the creek upstream, both of them beyond exhaustion but propelled by survival instinct. After what seemed like hours, Frank finally called a halt in a small clearing where massive boulders offered shelter on 3 sides. "Need to rest," he admitted, slumping against a rock. "Just for an hour." Amelia knelt beside him, concern overriding her own fatigue as she examined his arm in the gray pre-dawn light. The wound had reopened during the fight, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage. "It needs cleaning and proper dressing," she said, opening her satchel to find the medical supplies Mrs. Gunderson had packed. "Hold still." Frank submitted to her care with weary gratitude, his eyes never leaving her face as she worked. When she'd finished, he captured her hand in his. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting me, for fighting beside me. We make a good team," she replied, attempting lightness despite the gravity of their situation. "We do." Something in his tone made her meet his gaze. "Amelia, if we don't," she interrupted, pressing her fingers against his lips. "We're going to survive this. We're going to get these documents to Helena, and then—" She trailed off, uncertain what came after their shared mission. Frank's hand moved to cradle her cheek, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "And then," he prompted softly. Instead of answering with words, Amelia leaned forward and kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the confused, powerful emotions that had been building since he'd carried her bleeding form into the doctor's office. His response was immediate and devastating, his good arm pulling her closer as the kiss deepened from gratitude into something far more primal. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that since you first opened those green eyes in Doc Miller's office," he confessed, his voice rough. "Even though I was covered in blood and trail dust," she teased, marveling at how natural this felt despite the absurdity of their circumstances. "Especially then." His smile was brief but genuine. Never met a woman with such fire in her. The intimacy of the moment was shattered by a distant shout searchers, perhaps drawn by the cabin fire or their remaining pursuer calling for reinforcements. "We need to keep moving," Frank said, the gunfighter replacing the lover in an instant. "Mrs. Gunderson's brother's place is maybe 5 miles north of here, if we can reach it by midday." They set off again as the sun rose, both of them moving more slowly now as fatigue and injury took their toll. The forest gradually thinned, giving way to rolling grassland dotted with stands of pine and aspen. By mid-morning they'd seen no further sign of pursuit, but neither was willing to assume safety yet. "There," Frank said finally, pointing to a plume of smoke rising from a valley ahead. "That's Eric Gunderson's place. We made it." Relief made Amelia's knees weak, but she pressed on, following Frank down the gentle slope toward a neat cabin and barn nestled beside a small lake. As they approached, a burly man with a magnificent white beard emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. Frank raised his arm in greeting. "Eric." "It's Frank Vaughn." The man squinted, then lowered his weapon. "Frank, what in tarnation?" he broke off as they drew closer and he saw their condition. "Lord Almighty, you two look half dead. Get in here." Eric Gunderson proved to be as formidable and kind-hearted as his sister. He asked no questions as he fed them, tended their wounds with surprising gentleness for such massive hands, and prepared a pallet by the fire where they could rest. "My sister sent word yesterday," he explained as Amelia sipped hot broth that seemed like nectar after their ordeal. "Said you might be coming, might have trouble following. Didn't expect you on foot, though. Had to abandon the horses," Frank explained briefly. "Men after Miss Barton, railroad business." Eric nodded sagely. "Figured as much. Northern Pacific's been throwing weight around these parts. Ran the Petersons off their place last month." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Got a wagon. Can take you to Fort Benton tomorrow. Steamboat's due day after." "We'd be grateful," Frank said, exhaustion evident in every line of his body despite his attempt to stay alert. "Rest now," the older man commanded. "I'll keep watch. Nobody comes near my place without me knowing." With the immediate danger past, both Frank and Amelia succumbed to sleep almost instantly, their bodies demanding recovery. When Amelia woke, the cabin was dark except for the glow from the hearth. She found herself nestled against Frank's side, his good arm curled protectively around her, his breathing deep and even. For the first time since fleeing Miles City, she allowed herself to truly believe they might survive this, might reach Helena with her father's evidence, might see justice done. And after that, she studied Frank's face in the firelight, the strong lines softened in sleep, and felt a surge of emotion so powerful it frightened her. She'd come west seeking justice, not love. Certainly not this complicated, unexpected connection with a quiet rancher who carried his own ghosts. Yet somehow, in the midst of danger and desperation, something had blossomed between them that she didn't want to deny. Frank stirred, his eyes opening to find her watching him. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of all that had happened and all that might yet be hanging between them. "You're thinking too loud," he murmured finally, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile. "Sorry," she whispered, "not sorry at all. Just wondering what happens when this is over." His expression grew serious. "What do you want to happen?" It was a deceptively simple question with no simple answer. Before her father's murder, Amelia had planned a life of independence in Boston, perhaps taking over his banking interests, certainly never considering a future in the Montana wilderness with a rancher she'd known for barely a week. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's all happening so fast." Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We get to Helena first. Make sure your father's evidence reaches the right hands after that. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gentle touch at odds with his strength. After that, we have time to figure things out if you want to. The simplicity of his approach steadied her. One step at a time. First survival, then justice, then possibility. I want to, she whispered, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed his solemn face. Eric Gunderson's wagon departed for Fort Benton at dawn the next day, with both of them concealed beneath a load of hides and furs. The older man had insisted on the precaution, despite the lack of obvious pursuit, grumbling that railroad men have eyes everywhere these days. The journey passed uneventfully, the sturdy wagon covering the miles to Fort Benton by late afternoon. The settlement was larger than Amelia had expected, a bustling river port where steamboats docked on their way up and down the Missouri River. River boats due by noon tomorrow, Eric confirmed after speaking with the harbor master. Guess you'll be needing rooms for the night. They found lodging in a modest boarding house run by a widow who asked no questions beyond whether they preferred one room or two. The awkward silence that followed her inquiry made the woman smile knowingly. 2 rooms, Frank said finally, though the look he gave Amelia held a question. 2 rooms, Amelia confirmed, though part of her wished for a different answer. Propriety still mattered, even in the wilderness, and her reputation would be important when presenting her father's evidence to officials in Helena. They ate dinner in the boarding house's small dining room, both acutely aware that this might be their last evening together. Tomorrow would bring the steamboat, then Helena, then uncertainty. Will you go back to Boston? Frank asked as they sat on the boarding house porch afterward, watching the sunset paint the Missouri River in shades of gold and crimson. Amelia considered the question. I don't know. There's nothing for me there anymore. Father's bank was sold after his death. She glanced at him. Will you go back to your ranch? It's my home, he said simply. Then, more hesitantly, could be yours too if you wanted. The offer hung in the air between them, momentous despite its casual delivery. Amelia felt her heart race, not with fear this time but with possibility. Frank, she began, uncertain how to respond to such an enormous proposal after so short an acquaintance, despite all they'd been through together. He shook his head. Don't answer now, just think about it. Before she could reply, a commotion from the street drew their attention. 3 riders were approaching the boarding house at a gallop, and even in the fading light, Amelia recognized the lead figure, Wilson's foreman, the man who'd survived their cabin fight. Inside, Frank urged, pulling her to her feet. Now. They barely made it through the door before the riders reined up outside. Frank positioned Amelia behind him as the boarding house keeper approached, frowning at the disruption. Can I help you gentlemen? The widow asked, her tone making it clear that she found their arrival unwelcome. Looking for 2 travelers, a harsh voice replied. Man and woman. She's a thief, he's helping her. Reward for information. Nobody here but regular boarders, the woman replied smoothly. And I don't take kindly to accusations against my guests. Frank drew his revolver, which Eric had returned to him before they parted. Back door, he whispered to Amelia. She nodded, having noted the exit when they arrived. They slipped through the kitchen while the widow continued to rebuff the men at the front door, her voice growing increasingly indignant at their insistence. The back alley was dark and quiet. Frank led Amelia toward the riverfront, both of them keeping to the shadows between buildings. They'd almost reached the docks when shouts behind them indicated their absence had been discovered. The riverboat, Frank decided, pulling her toward where several vessels were moored along the waterfront. If we can hide aboard until morning, there they are. The cry came from behind them, followed by the crack of a pistol shot. They ran flat out now, abandoning stealth for speed. The nearest steamboat was a massive side-wheeler, its gangplank down as crew loaded cargo for the morning departure. Frank and Amelia raced up it, ignoring the startled exclamations of deckhands. "Find somewhere to hide," Frank told her as they reached the deck. "I'll keep them busy." "No," Amelia grabbed his arm. "We stay together." There was no time to argue. They ducked into a passageway as their pursuers reached the gangplank, shouting for the crew to stop them. The interior of the steamboat was a maze of narrow corridors and small cabins. They moved quickly, trying doors until one opened to reveal a cramped storage room filled with linens and supplies. "In here," Frank urged, closing the door behind them just as boots thundered past in the corridor. They stood in the darkness, barely breathing, listening to the sounds of search above and around them. Amelia clutched her satchel tightly, the documents that had cost so much blood and pain secure against her side. "If they catch us," she began in a whisper. "They won't," Frank cut her off, his voice certain. "But if they do, you run, get to Helena, finish what your father started." "Not without you," she insisted. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers interlacing with quiet strength. "Together, then." The search continued for what felt like hours, voices calling back and forth, doors opening and closing. Eventually, the sounds grew more distant, then faded entirely. Still, they waited, unwilling to risk discovery so close to their goal. It was near midnight when a new commotion arose, angry voices on the dock, the boarding house widow's strident tones among them. "That's Mrs. Hollister," Amelia whispered, recognizing their landlady's voice. "What's happening?" Frank eased the door open slightly, peering into the corridor. Finding it empty, he led Amelia cautiously toward a window that overlooked the docks. Below them, a confrontation was underway between the widow, several townspeople, and Wilson's men. "Those folks are thieves and killers," the foreman was shouting. "We've got warrants for their arrest." "From who?" "Judge Wilson." A burly man stepped forward, the town marshal's badge glinting on his chest. "That don't carry weight here, Reynolds. This is Chowdo County, not Miles City." "We have jurisdiction, not here, you don't," the marshal cut him off. "I've had word about Wilson and his railroad schemes. You boys can either leave peaceful-like or spend the night in my jail. Your choice." Frank and Amelia exchanged looks of disbelief as the marshal and several armed townsmen faced down their pursuers. After a tense standoff, Wilson's men backed down, mounting their horses and riding slowly away. "Fort Benton's not as friendly to Northern Pacific as Miles City," Frank observed with quiet satisfaction. "Railroad's been trying to bypass them on the new route. Looks like they remember that." They waited until the docks were clear before emerging from hiding. The night air was cool off the river, stars brilliant in the vast Montana sky. For the first time in days, Amelia felt the knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. "We should find the marshal," she suggested. "Tell him our side of the story before morning." Frank nodded agreement. As they made their way toward town, he stopped suddenly, turning to face her. "Before we do that," he said, his expression serious in the moonlight, "I need to know something." "What is it?" "All this time, I've been fighting beside you for your father's cause, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat." His eyes held hers intently. "But I need to know if there's something worth fighting for after Helena, something between us." Amelia's breath caught at the directness of the question. In the days since she'd stumbled bleeding into Miles City, she'd come to know this man as she'd never known anyone. His courage, his quiet strength, his profound capacity for loyalty and love. What had begun as gratitude had transformed into something far deeper during their shared ordeal. "Yes," she said simply, the single word carrying the weight of future possibility. "There is, Frank. There is something between us." The smile that broke across his face made her heart leap. He pulled her to him with gentle urgency, his kiss a promise that needed no words to interpret. When they finally approached the marshal's office, it was with fingers intertwined and steps matched in perfect rhythm. The steamboat Missouri Maiden departed Fort Benton at noon the next day. Amelia and Frank aboard as legitimate passengers with tickets purchased using the last of Amelia's Boston funds. The marshal had not only listened to their story, but had telegraphed ahead to the federal authorities in Helena, ensuring someone would meet them upon arrival. Standing at the railing as Fort Benton receded behind them, Amelia felt a curious mixture of triumph and trepidation. In her satchel, her father's meticulously gathered evidence would soon deliver justice, but what came after remained uncertain. Having second thoughts, Frank asked, joining her at the rail, his arm brushing hers in a touch that had become wonderfully familiar. "About the evidence?" "Never." She turned to face him, the sun bringing out auburn highlights in his brown hair. "About us? Not second thoughts, just thoughts," he nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. "It's fast what's happened between us." "Under any other circumstances, but these are our circumstances," she interrupted gently. "The ones that brought us together. True enough." His smile held a hint of wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe their path. "Where I come from, folks would say God moves in mysterious ways." "Is that what you believe?" Amelia was curious about this aspect of him she hadn't yet explored. Frank considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I believe there's purpose in how our paths crossed. Whether that's God or fate or just plain luck, I can't say for certain." His hand covered hers on the railing. "But I'm grateful for it, whatever the cause." The Missouri Maiden made good time downriver, stopping briefly at trading posts and small settlements. They kept mostly to themselves during the journey, both aware that danger might still find them before they reached Helena. But with each mile the steamboat covered, their cautious optimism grew. On the third day of their journey, as they approached the territorial capital, Frank found Amelia again at the railing, her expression pensive as she watched the rugged landscape pass. "Almost there," he noted, coming to stand beside her. She nodded, a hint of melancholy in her smile. "It's strange. I've been so focused on getting these documents to Helena I haven't really thought about what happens after." She glanced at him. "Except us. And what are you thinking about us?" His voice was carefully neutral, giving her space to answer honestly. Amelia took a deep breath. "I'm thinking that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, Frank Vaughn, and that terrifies me and exhilarates me in equal measure." His expression softened. "I know that feeling well." "But," she continued, needing to voice her concerns, "I also wonder if what's between us is real or if it's just the circumstances, danger, proximity, shared purpose." "Fair question." Frank didn't seem offended by her doubt. Back home, courting's usually a slower affair. Sunday socials and chaperoned visits. A smile touched his lips. Less gunfire, generally speaking. The humor broke her tension, making her laugh despite herself. "Substantially less, I would hope. But consider this," he said, turning serious again. "In a week, we've seen each other at our worst and our best. No pretense, no social niceties hiding the truth of who we are." His eyes held hers. "I know your courage, your determination, your heart, Amelia, better than I might have after months of proper courtship." The simple wisdom of his perspective struck her forcefully. He was right, the intensity of their experience had stripped away the layers that normally take months or years to penetrate. "When you put it that way," she began, a smile spreading across her face. "Besides," he added with a hint of mischief, "who says the adventure has to end in Helena? Seems to me we've only just started." The promise in those words warmed her more than the Montana sunshine. "What are you proposing, Mr. Vaughn?" "Nothing yet," he replied, his tone light but his eyes serious. "That would be premature, even for us. But I am suggesting that when this business with the railroad is finished, we take time to discover what we might be together without bullets flying around our heads." "I'd like that," Amelia said, realizing as she spoke how much she truly meant it. The thought of returning east held no appeal compared to the possibility of building something with this man who had saved her life, and perhaps her heart as well. Helena appeared on the horizon the next morning, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled against the foothills of the Big Belt Mountains. As the territorial capital, it was larger and more developed than any settlement Amelia had seen since leaving the East, with proper streets and substantial buildings of brick and stone. As promised, a federal marshal was waiting when they disembarked. Marshal James Cooper was a tall man with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the saddle. "Miss Barton," he inquired, approaching them on the dock. "Got a wire from Fort Benton about you, and you must be Vaughn." "That's right," Frank confirmed, instinctively placing himself slightly in front of Amelia, a protective gesture that hadn't diminished despite their apparent safety. "No need for that, son," Cooper said, noting the movement with experienced eyes. "You're among friends now." "Got my best deputies watching for Wilson's men. They show their faces in Helena. They'll regret it." The marshal escorted them to a modest hotel near the territorial offices, explaining that the governor himself wanted to see Amelia's evidence the following morning. "Territorial prosecutor will be there too," Cooper added as they reached the hotel. "Word is, the Northern Pacific's land acquisitions have been concerning folks in high places for some time. Just needed proof." "My father provided it," Amelia said, patting her satchel, "at great cost." "And you delivered it at no small cost yourself," the marshal observed. "Brave thing you did, Miss Barton. Not many would have seen it through." "I didn't do it alone," she replied, her hand finding Frank's. Marshal Cooper's eyes flickered to their clasped hands, then back to their faces, a hint of understanding in his weathered features. "Get some rest. I'll have a man outside your doors tonight. Governor expects you at 10 tomorrow." After the marshal left, they stood awkwardly in the hotel corridor, suddenly uncertain in this new context of safety and civilization. 2 rooms had been arranged for them, side by side, a proper arrangement that nonetheless felt strange after days of fighting and fleeing together. "Well," Frank said finally, a hint of reluctance in his voice, "I suppose we should get some rest. Big day tomorrow." "Yes," Amelia agreed, equally hesitant to part. "Frank, she stopped, unsure how to express the tumult of emotion she felt standing there in a quiet hotel hallway, clean and safe for the first time in what felt like forever. He seemed to understand without words, as he so often did. Gently, he raised her hand to his lips, the gesture courtly and tender in equal measure. "Until morning," he said softly, his eyes conveying everything words couldn't. Amelia slept fitfully despite the comfort of a real bed, too accustomed to danger to fully relax, too aware of Frank's absence beside her. When morning came, she dressed carefully in clothing the hotel had provided, not her usual Boston finery, but clean and presentable enough for a meeting with the territorial governor. Frank was waiting in the hotel dining room, similarly refreshed, his wounded arm properly bandaged by a local doctor. The sight of him tall and steady, his eyes lighting when he saw her, made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with growing certainty about what she wanted for her future. "Sleep well?" he asked as she joined him. "Not really," she admitted. "You?" Kept expecting to hear gunshots, he replied with a rueful smile. Guess it takes time to remember how to be safe. Marshal Cooper arrived after they'd eaten, escorting them through Helena's bustling streets to the territorial offices. The governor, a portly man with intelligent eyes and a carefully groomed beard, received them in a wood-paneled office that wouldn't have looked out of place in Boston. "Miss Barton," he greeted her, extending his hand. "Governor Benjamin Potts. Your journey to reach us has already become something of a legend in these parts. This is Mr. Frank Vaughn," Amelia introduced. "Without him, neither I nor these documents would have reached Helena." The governor shook Frank's hand with genuine respect. "Then we're in your debt as well, Mr. Vaughn. Now, let's see this evidence that's caused such a commotion." For the next 2 hours, Amelia laid out her father's meticulously gathered documentation: loan records, land transfers, private correspondence revealing a systematic conspiracy to defraud homesteaders and ranchers along the Northern Pacific's planned route. The territorial prosecutor, a sharp-eyed younger man named Sullivan, examined each document with growing excitement. "This is more than enough to bring charges," he declared finally. "Against Judge Wilson, certainly, and possibly all the way up to railroad executives in St. Paul." "What happens now?" Amelia asked, a weight lifting from her shoulders as she realized her father's work and her dangerous journey had not been in vain. "We move quickly," Governor Potts said, his expression grave. "Telegraph orders will go out today to arrest Wilson and his associates. The federal courts will handle the prosecution to avoid local interference." "And Miss Barton's safety?" Frank asked, the concern in his voice warming Amelia's heart. "Will be guaranteed," the governor assured him. "Until this matter is fully resolved, we can arrange protective custody if needed." "That won't be necessary," Amelia said firmly. "I've imposed on Mr. Vaughn's protection long enough." She glanced at him, trying to read his expression. "And I have plans to consider." Frank's eyes held a question, one she answered with a small, private smile that promised conversation later. By late afternoon, events were moving with breathtaking speed. Telegrams confirmed that Judge Wilson had been taken into custody in Miles City, along with several Northern Pacific officials. The documents were secured in the territorial prosecutor's vault, copies made and dispatched to federal authorities in Washington. And Amelia found herself, for the first time in months, without a mission driving her forward. Standing on the hotel's veranda as the sun set over the mountains, she felt both accomplished and adrift. "Penny for your thoughts," Frank said, joining her with 2 cups of coffee. "Just thinking about how single-minded I've been," she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Getting Father's evidence to Helena has consumed me since the night he died, and now you're free," he finished for her, "to decide what comes next." She turned to face him fully, studying the face that had become so dear to her in so short a time. "What about you, Frank? What comes next for you?" He leaned against the railing, his expression thoughtful. "My place needs attention after being away. Cattle to tend, fences to mend." A smile touched his lips. "Mrs. Gunderson to appease for running off without proper explanation." "You're going back to Miles City," Amelia said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "It's my home," he confirmed, then added more softly, "but I find myself hoping it might become someone else's home too in time." Her heart quickened at the careful invitation in his words. "It's a lovely area," she said, matching his cautious tone, "from what little I saw of it when not bleeding or fleeing for my life." The gentle humor broke the tension, bringing a chuckle from Frank. "There are definitely more peaceful ways to experience Montana territory." His expression grew more serious. "I know it's not Boston, not what you're accustomed to, but it's a good life, Amelia, Hard sometimes, but good. I wasn't very happy in Boston, she admitted, moving closer to him. Not even before Father died. Always felt constrained by what society expected of a banker's daughter. And what does Amelia Barton expect for herself? Frank asked, his voice low and intent. She considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would set her course for years to come. I want purpose, she said finally. I want to build something meaningful. She met his gaze directly. I want a partner, not just a husband, someone who sees me as I am and values that. Frank's eyes never left hers as he reached slowly for her hand. I see you, Amelia, have since that first day in Miles City. The simple declaration moved her more than flowery professions of love might have. In it was recognition, respect, and a depth of feeling that needed no embellishment. I'm not proposing marriage, he continued, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. Not yet. That would be too soon, even for us. But I am asking if you might consider returning to Miles City with me, seeing if what's grown between us can flourish in peacetime as it did in war. Amelia thought of the path that had brought her to this moment, her father's murder, her desperate flight west, the bullet that might have ended her life if not for the cowboy who'd acted without question when she needed him most. What might have seemed like misfortune had led her to this man, this possibility of happiness she'd never anticipated. Yes, she said, the decision feeling right in her bones. I'd like that very much. The journey back to Miles City was markedly different from their flight to Helena, undertaken by stagecoach on proper roads, without pursuit or fear of discovery. They passed through Fort Benton long enough to thank Eric Gunderson and the marshal who had helped them, then continued eastward through the rolling Montana landscape. Amelia found herself seeing the territory with new eyes, not as a dangerous wilderness to be survived, but as a land of beauty and possibility. And beside her, Frank pointed out features he loved. The way sunlight played across distant buttes, the particular blue of the sky after a rain shower, the wild herbs that scented the air when crushed underfoot. By the time they reached Miles City, 2 weeks after departing Helena, Amelia had begun to understand what drew people to this rugged country, the sense of space and freedom, the directness of human relationships unencumbered by excessive social convention, the opportunity to build something uniquely one's own. Their return caused something of a sensation. Judge Wilson's arrest and the railroad scandal had become the talk of the territory, and the woman who had delivered the evidence and the rancher who had helped her were minor celebrities. Doc Miller greeted them like returning heroes, and Mrs. Gunderson smothered both in tearful embraces before turning stern about Frank's still healing arm. "You said small trip to Helena," she scolded as she inspected his wound at the ranch house. "Not shootout and steamboat and federal marshals." "Next time I'll be more specific," Frank promised, earning him a swat from the housekeeper that made Amelia laugh. Life settled into a rhythm over the next months. Frank returned to the work of his ranch, while Amelia found herself drawn to community matters in Miles City. With the territorial prosecutor's encouragement, she established a small legal aid office to help homesteaders and ranchers understand their rights against corporate interests, work that honored her father's memory while making use of the business knowledge he'd instilled in her. And through it all, their relationship deepened and evolved, courting done backward from most, beginning with life and death intimacy, and moving toward the everyday discoveries of shared meals, conversations about books and ideas, learning each other's habits and histories in the quietness of ordinary days. 6 months after their return from Helena, on a crisp autumn evening with the first hint of winter in the air, Frank took Amelia riding to a ridge overlooking his property. The valley below was touched with gold as the setting sun caught the autumn-dried grass, cattle moving like dark dots across the landscape. "I bought more land," he told her as they sat side by side on a fallen log, horses grazing nearby. "Another 100 acres to the north. Good water rights." "That's wonderful," Amelia said, genuinely pleased for him. The ranch was thriving under his careful management, and the recent verdict in the railroad case had secured land rights for many small holders throughout the territory. "I've been thinking about building," Frank continued, a hint of nervousness in his usually steady voice. "The cabin's fine for now, but not for a family." Amelia's heart quickened at the word. "A family?" Frank turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. The man who had faced armed pursuers without flinching now looked almost afraid. "I love you, Amelia," he said simply. "I think I started loving you when you opened your eyes in Doc Miller's office and looked at me like I might actually be able to help you." A smile touched his lips. "You've brought life back to me when I thought that part of me was buried with Rebecca and Emma." Tears pricked at Amelia's eyes, but she remained silent, sensing he needed to say everything he'd prepared. "I know it hasn't been that long," he continued, "and I'd understand if you wanted to wait. But I'm certain of what I feel, and I hope you might feel the same." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. "This was my mother's." Inside lay a simple gold band with a small diamond, not ostentatious but beautifully crafted. Frank looked from the ring to her face, vulnerability and hope mingled in his expression. "Amelia Barton, will you marry me? Build a life here with me?" The tears spilled over now, running unchecked down her cheeks as joy welled up inside her. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, Frank. Yes to all of it." His smile was like sunrise as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that held all the promise of their future together. They were married 2 weeks later in Miles City's small church, with Doc Miller giving the bride away and Mrs. Gunderson weeping noisily in the front pew. The entire town turned out for the celebration afterward, music and dancing continuing well into the night. When they finally returned to the ranch, their home now, truly shared, Frank carried Amelia across the threshold in the traditional gesture that seemed especially fitting given how their journey together had begun, with him carrying her wounded form to safety. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn," he murmured against her hair. "I like the sound of that," she replied, lifting her face for his kiss. The years that followed brought challenges, as frontier life always did: harsh winters, difficult cattle drives, the ordinary complications of building a life together. But they also brought deep joy. The birth of their son William 2 years after their marriage, followed by daughter Catherine 3 years later, the gradual expansion of both ranch and community as Miles City grew, the satisfaction of seeing the legal reforms sparked by Thomas Barton's evidence take root throughout the territory. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work done, Frank and Amelia would sometimes sit on their porch, watching the Montana stars wheel overhead, hands linked in the comfortable silence of two people who had faced death together and chosen life. "You ever regret it?" Frank asked once, many years after that fateful day in Miles City. "Staying here instead of returning east?" Amelia considered the question seriously, as was her way. At 42, she had silver threading her once golden hair and laugh lines around her eyes. The ranch had prospered under their joint stewardship, and their children were growing into capable, thoughtful young people. Her legal aid work had expanded to 3 offices across the territory, helping ensure that the reforms her father died for remained meaningful in practice, not just on paper. "Never," she answered truthfully. "Not for a moment." She squeezed his hand, strong and weathered now but still as gentle as when he'd first reached out to catch her falling form. "Everything I've built here, everything we've built together, matters in a way nothing in Boston ever did." Frank nodded, understanding as he always had the deeper currents of her thoughts. "You saved me, you know," he said quietly. "That day in the street you weren't the only one bleeding." Amelia leaned against his shoulder, thinking of the wounded man he'd been when they met, bleeding inside from losses too great to bear alone. "We saved each other," she corrected gently, "and that's been the pattern ever since." As the stars brightened above them and coyotes called in the distant hills, they sat together in the peace. They'd earned two people who had begun as strangers thrown together by violence and need, and become partners bound by the deepest love either had known. The cowboy who hadn't asked questions, and the woman who'd been brave enough to trust him, building a life neither could have imagined that bloody day in Miles City so many years before.